Welcome. Just a quick show of hands, because some of you have not been to one of these before. I know, looking around the room. Who has been before? Okay, so sort of half. So in that case, I'll do a quick bit about what on earth have you walked into. So my name is Nick Perrett. I'm the founder and CEO of Prosper. Prosper is a digital wealth platform. So we do savings, investments, pensions, all of that kind of thing. We've had a phenomenal year, courtesy to many of you in this room. So we've got 10 times as more members as we had a year ago, 18 times as much money, which means people are trusting us with a lot more money of their money over time. And our why for organizing these events is basically that if you're a Prosper member, then you're philosophically thinking about, how do I want to build wealth over the next 20 years for future generations, my children? How am I going to deal with all of those issues? And obviously, if you're thinking about the future, then you are probably interested in how the world is going to change. So we organize these events on topics that we think are going to be impactful in a sort of 20, 30 year horizon. And today is really focusing on technology innovations. Every single person in this room probably has a lot of their future staked on, what was it you said, data centers and AI companies, American technology companies. So it's kind of interesting to really dig into what kind of a world might we end up with. So that's a bit about Prosper and why we're doing these things. This one today is actually in partnership with one of our shareholders, Portfolio Ventures. And I think, Will, you're just going to say a quick couple of words on the portfolio side.
Hi, well, it's very nice to see so many familiar faces here. But for those of you that don't know me, my name is Will Martin. I'm one of the co-founders of Portfolio Ventures. We are a London-based VC investing in SaaS and fintech companies at pre-seed and seed, and always alongside our very good friends. We do a lot of co-investments with tier one VCs as well. Our current portfolio, which includes Prosper, I'm very glad to say, is performing extremely well and is now tracking with top decile US funds. And we're now seeing, as liquidity is getting freed up in the market, so many of those portfolio companies raising very big Series A, B, and now even C rounds. We're raising fresh capital ourselves. And so if you would like to learn more and want to be a part of one of the best EIS funds in the UK, then please come and find me or my co-founder, Will Brooks, who's right here, later today. And finally, I'd just like to say that Will and I are delighted to be co-hosting today's event with Nick and the Prosper team. And I'd like to thank Carl for taking the time to talk to us today.
Thank you, Will. Right, Carl. So Carl is the Dieter Schwartz Professor of AI and Work at the Oxford Internet Institute. He's also a fellow of Mansfield College. He's also a director of the Future of Work program at the Oxford Martin School, and author of this book, which has just been put up for the FT Book of the Year. Well done, you. So that, I think the short version is, Carl is extremely busy, it would seem. So I'm delighted that you can spare the time to talk to us about this book and thinking in general. You've got an extremely provocative title. So do we like the idea that progress is going to end potentially? A little bit of a doomsday things potentially. But I think a really interesting aspect of how you start the discussion in the book is you have this quote in there, which I have to say, I had to look it up because I've seen the future and it works. For me is Prince and the Batman movie. But I had to sort of dig into the fact that actually it's Lincoln Steffens, who was one of a thing that I'd not heard of, a muckraker who visited Russia in 1919 and was actually writing about how incredible Russia was from a technological perspective. And I think what's really interesting, and I wanted to get you to share your perspective today, is I think a lot of us in the room have grown up through a period of sort of consistent economic growth. I mean, yes, there are sort of bumps along the way, but you've got 1,000 years and way more examples than just one on Russia of history in here of actually that's not really true. That you shouldn't assume that we will always progress.
Yeah, that's right. So, first of all, thank you very much for having me. It's a really, really pleasure to be here. And thank you all for coming and joining us for this conversation. So, the point of the book is not that progress is inevitably about to end, but it is a pushback against this narrative coming out of Silicon Valley in particular that it is inevitable. And the way I like to put it, if progress was inevitable, it wouldn't take humanity 200,000 years to have an industrial revolution. If progress was inevitable, most of the world today would be rich and prosperous. If progress was inevitable, we wouldn't see former technology leaders like Britain experiencing productivity stagnation. And in fact, if you take London out of the United Kingdom, the rest is now poorer than the state of Mississippi. So let that sink in for a while. So there's nothing inevitable about technological progress. And as I point out in the book, often we look to a place that is growing rapidly and we're saying, wonderful, why couldn't we just be like them? Back in 1919, or I should say even more so, where after the Civil War, many were looking to Russia as the future. And Russia, in the Soviet Union, it is important to remember, it's seen as a failure today, but it was actually growing at respectable rates of around 6% per year for around 4 decades. And Russia was good at one thing. It was good at mobilizing resources for key priorities. Soviet planners made ample use of the Ford factory's open door policy, and they used that essentially to transplant an automotive industry in Russia and build a host of industries producing vehicles. And as long as progress was incremental, Soviet planners could quite easily benchmark performance and see, well, you're clearly slacking off here, your competitors, they're producing much more than you are. And that's easy to do in a relatively static technology field, but it's much harder to do when you're dealing with novelty, because what are you benchmarking against? And so the Soviet Union did very well in the era of mass production, but the returns to that eventually petered out. And so the Soviet Union essentially collapsed because they couldn't really make the adjustments to the computer revolution. Soviet contributions to computing were essentially non-existent. The way I've sort of tried to explain the framework in the book is that the Soviet Union was very good at scaling. They were very good at scaling in steel and in a host of other industries, but they weren't very good at exploring new technologies. And so if you were an aircraft engineer in the Soviet Union, you could go to the Red Army and ask for funding. If they declined, maybe you had 2 or 3 different options. If they declined, your idea would die with you. That's quite different from Google and Bessemer Venture, which declined to invest back in 1999. But that just illustrates that Google wasn't a safe bet at the time, right? Alta Vista and Yahoo were dominating search, but that wasn't the end of Google because there were others stepping in and investing. And that's the virtue of a decentralized system, that you can explore more technological trajectories. So you can often mistake a period of scaling and rapid growth for, eternal progress. But the key point is that once those returns peter out, you need to adjust to new technological realities and explore new trajectories. That requires decentralization, whereas scaling benefits from centralization.
So if you think about technology, the technology industry, and in particular the AI, whether it's a boom or not, we were talking about before, if the technology is only valuable if it actually delivers productivity gains. And you're sort of pointing out that as yet we're not seeing a lot of those productivity gains in the data. Are you talking specifically about economic data when you're saying that? So you're looking at it from a very macro point of view, and you can't see the impact yet?
Yeah. So let me hedge that a little bit. So technology can be valuable even if it doesn't increase productivity. It can, be valuable to consumers. And, I wouldn't say that Google search is not valuable, although it isn't in the productivity statistics. But, we always mismeasured stuff. And so that's nothing new in itself. And what is also true is that there is a very strong correlation between income and subjective well-being, right? So the correlation is around 0.8. Incomes are top-coded, and so you can only track up until around 400,000 per year. But there is no pattern or whereby you can see that the correlation starts to bring down as you approach higher levels of income. And so productivity incomes are meaningful for subjective well-being. An economy that isn't growing is essentially a zero-sum game. The only way you're better off is at the expense of somebody else if the economy is not growing. And that means that you have a lot more competition for resources, you get much more polarized politics, etc., as we are having today as a consequence. And so I mentioned earlier, Britain has experienced productivity stagnation, and Britain is doing particularly badly among the OECD economies. But we are having a global productivity slowdown, right? And so that's even true of the United States. It's even true of China, where productivity went into negative territory after the Great Recession and has remained stagnant since. And so a third of China's GDP today is real estate. And so we're not doing particularly well at the frontier anywhere. And the key hope we have is that AI will somehow reverse that trend. And it might. I'm not going to argue that it could not. But what is really striking to me is that if you go back to the computer revolution of the 1980s and 90s, right? It gave us the personal computer. It gave us the internet, which means that all of a sudden we could connect the best talent around the world. And most people have essentially the world's stored knowledge in their pockets. Both computers and the internet are the ultimate research tools that you can think of. And all you get is like a blip in productivity growth confined to the United States for about a decade. And so AI today, I would argue, is nowhere near as transformative as the personal computer and the internet. It might eventually be, but I think there's something more fundamental going on there, which is probably that our institutions are not very well equipped in adjusting to these new technologies, right? So think about it this way. Even if AI ends up being a hugely important tool for medical research, which I think is feasible, 80% of the costs are still in stage 3 clinical trials. And so even if AI gives a huge boost to research, you're still going to bottleneck most of those gains in those clinical trials unless you deregulate or make FDA approval much more streamlined. And I think we are seeing similar bottlenecks in a variety of domains. Obviously, when you have a tool that is a productivity tool, you can use the time that you gain in different ways. You can decide to do more things with your time and extend the portfolio of tasks you can do, or you can spend the time drilling deeper. And I think we have pretty clear evidence that people have often opted for, at least in academia and among inventors as well, more projects. And we have fairly clear evidence that the more things you do, the less impactful each of those things are likely to be. And so we're using these tools to drill more holes rather than digging deeper, it seems to me. And I think there's a risk that we will accelerate that trend with AI. And it probably has something to do with institutions and culture. If you're an academic, you probably, you're more likely to win a Nobel Prize if you spend, 10 or 20 years focusing on one thing. But at some point, your colleagues in the department are going to ask questions. What on earth is Carl doing? He hasn't, published anything in 10 years. And so the more projects I do, the more things I can talk about in the coffee breaks, the more productive I seem. And I think, unfortunately, it's the wrong trajectory.
So if you go to the sort of the protagonists, and we've had a number of events talking about these protagonists of AI, and one of the so take Sam Altman as an example. It's a very utopian. We're ushering in an era of infinite prosperity with these technologies, and you're a skeptic of that fact. You're not saying it isn't possible. You're saying it, on the balance of probabilities, it might not be the outcome that we see. Is that fair?
I think that's fair. And, intelligence is an input, right, into something. And so nobody would say that the Democratic Republic of Congo is poor because people are less intelligent there, or that Britain is experiencing productivity slowdown because people are becoming less intelligent, right? And so intelligence is often not the binding constraint. Binding constraint is often incentives and vested interests and rules and regulation that steer activity in one or another direction. And so I think that people that are tremendously excited about AI, they tend to focus on the technology. And, the technology itself is important, don't get me wrong. I find it exciting to see these new models coming out as well. And I'm, very impressed by them in many ways. But at the same time, am I getting more innovative and creative? Am I doing better research as a result of these tools? I find them useful. I find them useful for shortcuts, mostly. And I don't think, shortcuts is going to lead to greater innovation. And in fact, I fear that our students are making even more shortcuts than I am. And as a result, they're not learning and retaining nearly as much. And so, reason that I can hopefully say something remotely coherent is that I've read and written about these topics for a long time. And when you write a book as well, in the early stages, you're forced to read a lot of stuff, and even write a lot of stuff that turns out to be completely redundant to the actual book, right? But in that process, you explore, you're learning new things, right? And when you're adding the final touches to a book, you're mainly supporting your own story, right? And so you're more selectively looking for information. And so when you can prompt AI to get you more specific answers than you would by reading 20 or 100 books, that means that you can take tremendous shortcuts, but you're not learning as much because you're missing the process of learning and all those redundant things for that particular project that still contributes to your own learning.
So I understand that there's that argument where it's almost like the bear case to why might this not be important. But let's just assume that the technology is important for a moment. A lot of what I really enjoyed in here was the thinking and the structure that you had around the conditions that would allow something to be successful, assuming it had intrinsic value. And you touched on a couple of things just in that last bit on the institutions, and you've got this notion of distributed. And actually, my brain went straight to crypto because you were talking about distributed versus bureaucratic, centralized, and the fact that if you're on either extreme, that can cause calamity. But it'd be interesting to get maybe if you can give an example of what you were talking about there with that.
Yeah. So, writing a book is the easiest example for me to give because that's what I've been doing, right? But it comes back to the previous point. early days, I need to explore. I need to figure out what it is I want to do. I need to read. I need to meet people. I need to discuss and debate. But at some point, I just need to sit down and execute and write things down. And that is a very different process. That is a process that can be planned and executed in a different way than the exploration phase can. And I think, most innovation, most businesses follow a similar trajectory. And so, if you take the vaccines that allowed us to escape the coronavirus pandemic, right? The mRNA vaccines were most effective. And they were most effective because people like Kathleen Carrico had seen the potential 30 years earlier, and they had worked on it, and that was a process of trial and error. And so when the pandemic hit, we could essentially develop a vaccine within weeks, right? But we needed then bureaucracies to actually produce and scale, and to take advantage of new technologies like factories, for example, and exploit economies of scale. You do need bureaucracies and hierarchies to manage things, and that's a very different stage of the technology lifecycle.
The other one that I found quite interesting that's very relevant to the current sort of AI situation was around vested interests. And in particular, we were talking about the sort of European approach with sort of GDPR type regulation versus the American antitrust type regulation, and how, the tools of government to prevent monopolies from killing essentially progress. You got some good examples on that?
Yes, most people don't like competition, right? We benefit from competition in other domains, but we don't want it in the domain we are working, right? And so it's natural that people try to put up barriers to entry in the industries they are, and it's the role of the public to try to prevent that. And so you can do that in different ways. Historically, antitrust has been an important tool for that. Not that breaking up Google would mean that the end of search monopolies. There would probably be another company that emerged in its place. Same thing if you broke up Meta. But it means that you have tools by which you can check anti-competitive behavior. And that means that you're keeping companies on their toes when it comes to rather invest in innovation rather than to invest in lobbying. And I think that's important. Now, there are well-intentioned regulations, as you mentioned, like the GDPR, which I don't think is predominantly due to vested interest, but they end up raising barriers to entry. They create compliance costs. Larger firms are better able to manage compliance costs. And so what you've seen in Europe is that the GDPR has been dismal for small firms in particular. It's been much less dismal for large tech companies who actually managed to offset compliance costs by capturing a larger share of the market. And so, broadly speaking, whether it's GDPR, whether it's environmental regulation, whether it's health and safety, all of these things, well-intentioned, are harder to manage for smaller firms. And then on top of that, the ones that are going to have a say on the regulation are the ones that are at the seat of the table. And those tend not to be future companies because they don't exist. It tends to be larger players that tend to try to bend their rules to their own advantage.
I think everybody here hopefully is still a UK tax resident and is not flighting. But obviously growth and progress, AI at the centre of that for the current British government. If you're thinking about the UK with all of the things that you know about the best possible environment, so let's pretend we're all optimists, the best possible environment we could create in the UK to give us the opportunity for progress to go in our favour? Are there things that you think that the UK is doing particularly well on or doing particularly badly on and needs to rethink?
So the UK has a lot of inventive talent. It has a lot of promising startups. It has good research universities. There's a lot of talent around the world that wants to come and live in the UK. And, it has a huge advantage through the English language. And so that makes UK productivity stagnation all the more surprising in many ways. I think what the UK lacks is it's never been particularly good at scaling. And even going back to the first industrial revolution, right? The UK grew rich at the time of small enterprise. And so UK factories were large by contemporary standards. But if you look across industries, firm size in the UK is smaller than it is in Germany and France and has been so for a long time. And so for scaling, you need a couple of things. You need cheap energy. The UK doesn't have it. You need good infrastructure. The UK doesn't have it. You need large markets. Unfortunately, the UK is too small. And even as a part of the European Union, and I think this is actually a key reason why Europe struggle in catching up in digital and in services in general, is that if you're in the US, you have a large homogeneous market to scale into. Same in China. The IMF estimates that if you take all the trade barriers that exist on services inside the European Union and add them up, they amount to 110% tariff. And so basically Trump Liberation Day tariffs self-imposed inside the European Union. And needless to say, the UK is no longer part of the European Union anyways. And so I think access to markets, large homogeneous markets, when it comes to digital and services, it's the biggest bottleneck of them all.
We've become a state in America. Awesome. Look, I would love to continue to talk to you, but I've got an audience who ask very erudite questions, and I want to give you guys the floor. There is a microphone. Who wants to ask the first question?
I haven't read your book, but I read the blurb as I was sitting here. We've been talking about progress is not inevitable. Is there at all a darker message? We've seen societies disappear. I was quite interested in Jared Diamond's book Collapse. And, in the days of the great financial crisis, we were talking about existential risk. Do you write about or do you think about more substantial risks to our societies?
The two separate questions. Do I think about them? Yes. So do I write about them in the book? Not so much. So the key example in the book of societal or state collapse would be the Soviet Union. And I think the key reason that the Soviet Union collapsed was that there was very little space for experimentation within the Soviet system. And so within the Soviet Union, every ministry essentially functioned as a functional department. So the railroads were managed all across the Soviet Union from Moscow, so was the steel industry, etc. In China, for example, on the other hand, most activity is managed on a local level. And so provincial governors have a lot of autonomy when it comes to, or gained a lot of autonomy after 1978 in terms of finding ways to attract foreign capital, to spur growth. And that meant that China could experiment a lot on a local level with reform, tie into global value chains, and become an engine of growth. And so I think a lesson from the book is that if you don't have any pockets for experimentation, it is hard to adjust to new technological realities. And I do think that the federal system in the United States also provides a laboratory for that. A key reason I think that Silicon Valley has been so successful, for example, is that non-competes are void. And so essentially, if you don't like a firm, you can move out and set up a new business. And that's happened multiple times when people left Shockley Semiconductor to set up Fairchild, when they left Fairchild to set up Intel. Had it not been for non-competes being void, those transformations would probably not have happened. And you see similarly in Michigan, where non-competes were once void, and Detroit was very much a hub of innovation, much like Silicon Valley has been in recent memory. In '85, Michigan reversed that, and you see a lot of less job hopping, particularly into new industries, as a consequence of that.
Thank you very much for your talk. I'll make a little bit of a hard question, not very comfortable one, but if you're the advisor to the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, what would be, in your opinion, the main opportunity? How could the United Kingdom position itself as a global player with AI, and how would they go about it?
They would never ask me to be advisor. Most of my advice is probably not that politically popular, but the first thing would be to re-enter the European Union. So that's number one. The second thing would then be to make sure that these barriers on trade and services are reduced within the European Union, so we have a harmonized market for services and digital. The other thing would be to invest more in infrastructure. Unfortunately, we missed a bit of an opportunity there when interest rates were low. It's a harder thing to do now. But when it comes to AI regulation, I think it's important not to repeat the mistakes of the GDPR. And I do worry that the EU AI Act is leading in a similar direction. If ChatGPT has not been released into the world, we will probably not be discussing AI regulation to begin with. And so to learn about something, to learn about both the upsides and the risks, something needs to be put into use and experimented with. And so it's better to regulate exposed than to regulate ex ante. And so I think that would be another point worth making.
I spend my life in and around boardrooms, and the big debate at the moment is the application of AI to good governance. So my question is around ethics. We're now seeing there's a lot of stuff around too many board papers. Founders don't understand how to deal with boards. So everybody's now using AI, to cut through 200 pages of board papers. These are the three things we need to focus on. We've had our first example in the last couple of weeks in America of an activist investor now suing a board because the board couldn't demonstrate it hadn't used AI to come up with an unbiased, unconscious bias judgment. Of course, the flip side of that is they could equally sue them if they had or hadn't used it either way, if it isn't what the investor wanted. So if we've got a world now where, dare I say, older board members are just pumping their board papers into ChatGPT and suddenly discovering the board papers have become open source, I kid you not. But if we spent years and years talking about diversity and human judgment and that in the boardroom, but now AI, a bit like students writing all their university essays with AI. So I'm just interested in your perspective of application of AI, user error in terms of the humans and the whole ethics of this.
Yeah, what to say? So, it's hard to prevent people from taking shortcuts, right? And so I don't think a course on ethics is likely to change that, unfortunately, and the technology is available out there. And what can you do? You can, make sure that the downsides are significant if you get caught, and you can try to increase the cost of people using these tools at work, potentially by incorporating internal tools that are safer to use. And so I don't know how you can prevent people from using technology that is out there, other than trying to change the people's cost-benefit analysis of doing so.
My ethics point is there's now the debate of should there be an AI bot have a seat at the board table because it has perfect judgment? And indeed, should it vote or should it not vote? So the ethics of how you employ that AI.
So look, if people want to have AI making decisions at their board, they could be my guest. I think, Anthropic did a little experiment where they, had Claude running their vending machine, right? And so the vending machine is not the most complicated of businesses, right? But, and people of Anthropic are probably more, trying to push the technology to its limits. But, it managed to convince Claude to give all employees 25% discounts. It, got it to stack the machine with metal cubes, which is sold at a discount. And, this is not the most complex business. And so AI is very good when there's a lot of precedent. But when precedent is thin, AI usually performs badly. And a board tends to deal with an uncertain and rapidly changing world. And so, a key risk when you're using AI is that it might perform very well under normal circumstances, but it might perform very badly when circumstances change, right? And so back in 2016, basically everybody knows AlphaGo beat the world champion at Go. Few people know that 2 years ago, human amateurs actually beat the best Go programs by exposing them to positions that they wouldn't have encountered in training. And so even when AI has achieved superhuman performance, humans can make a comeback. And so I would not want to have AI at the board of my company, but then again, I'm an academic and not an entrepreneur.
I'm not sure whether you cover this in the book, but you've got a lot of dynamics happening, obviously, which you do cover. But then the other layer that we've got is we've obviously got quite a big population now, but there's a massive shift. People are having less children. People are getting a lot older. How does that impact the future? Because who's going to look after those old people with young people not necessarily working, fewer of them? How does that impact on the society change?
Fertility decline is global and it's striking. And I think a large part comes down to technology and social media. And it's quite likely that AI might exacerbate that trend, although we don't have clear evidence for that. On the other hand, if it ends up boosting productivity, it's basically one of the few things that can somehow counteract some of those challenges. And so, to basically maintain just our standard of living, we need to boost productivity quite significantly, and to ensure that social security systems and etc. Continue working. And so AI, I think, is the best bet that we can do something to counteract that. But there's a risk that the use of AI, if people, feel lonely, they turn to AI rather than the friends. They build fewer meaningful relationships, and that might, exacerbate the tendencies we're seeing that, fewer people have stable relationships, fewer people have married, and fertility is down.
Just wanted to talk about Ray Kurzweil's book, Singularity is Near, and he admits that he gets his class to use AI, and he insists on them using AI in the class to do their work. Obviously, in your roles, many roles in education, how do you address that in your own classrooms? Can you pick up on it? Do you insist on it, or make sure they don't use AI?
So I have very little say in such matters because the university has policies on these things which keep changing. But, I assume they're using AI, let's put it that way. And so in the end of the day, if you don't know how to use the computer and if you don't know how to surf the internet, you wouldn't be able to function in the modern world, right? So obviously, students should learn how to use AI. And I suspect that most of them are more capable with AI than I am, to be frank. But at the same time, I do think that there needs to be spaces which are for learning. And, as I mentioned earlier, people that use AI for writing, they don't retain as much of that knowledge of what they read. Because AI has been doing the writing. And so I do very much think that in the classroom and probably beyond the classroom as well. There should be dedicated learning time where you have your books and your notebook, and that's basically about it. But then it might be 10 or 20% of learning time. People should use AI and try to improve on what they've been writing and use it to explore and learn. And so I'm happy to grant that the latest models, they're probably better tutor than anybody is, but the sort of world's leading experts, and they can throw back a structured answer at you within seconds or minutes, whereas a human person would in most cases need some time to think about most issues, unless it's something that you've thought about very deeply already.
I was interested in your question when you were talking about the AI and saying it's taken time to see any benefits. I was wondering whether the distribution of AI and its rapidity and its global spread gives you hope or dismay. In other words, the PC took 10 years to reach 100 million, and AI has reached billions in 2 years. So is there hope or dismay in that distribution? And then back to the more personal level, as you alluded to in that question there, what's your top tips for progress yourself? Do you think go down an AI route, or do you make yourself more productive and more progressive by focusing on human behavior? So what's your way of getting ahead? So the first question is, hope or dismay in the global productivity from AI around the world? And the second is, how do you approach progress on a personal basis?
So I think on the first question, it really is about what we're using AI for. And so the largest stint of sustained growth that the industrial West has seen was from 1920 to 1970. And that growth is in large part driven by the internal combustion engine and electricity. And I think what's important with those technologies is that they created huge new industries, right? So the auto industry was the largest industrial enterprise the world had ever seen. And then you have a host of suppliers producing all the components that go into a car. And then you have a range of industries producing the machine tools to make the components. And then you have road commerce emerging, tourism, travel, the airline industry, trucks, etc. And then with the electricity as well, essentially every gadget you have in your home, there was an industry behind that producing it, right? So it created a lot of new industries, new activities. And so if everything we had done since 1800 was automation, right, we would have cheap textiles and productive agriculture, right? But that's about it. We wouldn't have, rockets, airplanes, computers, vaccines, antibiotics. And so most growth comes from doing new things. And first industrial revolution, early days centered a lot on mechanization of textiles, and as a result, growth wasn't that rapid. I think with robots, similar things, it's about automation. Growth hasn't been as rapid. So I think for AI to really, deliver a sustained boost to productivity, it needs to create new industries and new activities, not just be a productivity tool. On a personal level, I think, try in some ways to stick to your normal habits. And so sit down with a book and read undisturbed, and, put your phone in a locker somewhere. I struggle to do that myself. And then I think, if you're an academic and if you're somebody who sort of tries to push the frontiers in anything you do, stay focused on that thing and don't try to do too many things. And then I think in-person communication is going to become increasingly valuable, right? So if AI writes your letters and everybody else says, right, meetings become more important for, differentiating yourself. And so go to more events, meet more people, come to all my talks. That's what I'm trying to say. And so, yeah, and buy the book and read it.
How confident are you that historical lessons about technological change apply in the context of AI, given what seems to be a kind of very different speed and nature of development? Is it possible that this time is different, that fundamentally previous rules and kind of patterns might not apply?
So every time is different to some degree, right? And so it would be absurd to suggest that nothing is different this time. But the rules and regulations that we have in place isn't that different, right? And so the FDA, if it doesn't change its rules in response to AI, then those will still be the same. And more sort of fundamentally, I think the point around what you do with it still matters, right? And so do you use it for automation? Do you use it to build new industries? I don't think that's that different with AI versus if you use computers and the internet to build a new industry or to make email a little bit more efficient. So I think there are certain rules that do apply, but let's say that with AI we have something out there that is better than me and you in every conceivable domain. Of course, that would be unprecedented. I mean, there's no question about that. And I think a lot of people in professional services, myself included, are probably not quite prepared for the sort of loss of status that is coming for us when a lot of people can, quite easily do many things that we pride ourselves with. And I wrote an op-ed in New York Times recently where I argued that what's happening with AI is reducing barriers to entry in a lot of knowledge work at the moment. And we're likely to see more competition for places with lower wages, in like Manila or India or the UAE. And so I think that's likely to be an unwelcome source of competition for many.
Today, all the big tech companies are in the US and maybe some in China. How do you see this will impact the UK and Europe? Because we really don't have any significant tech companies.
Obviously, it is a problem to be too dependent on allies and your trading partners, and particularly if those allies tend to be unpredictable in their behavior. At the same time, no country, not even the US, can hope to be technologically self-sufficient, right? And not even China. In the end of the day, do I really care if a Chinese scientist cures cancer or a British scientist does it, right? I benefit in both instances. And so as long as it is not the political adversary that is pushing the frontiers of technology, and as long as we can access those technologies through trade, you can still benefit. But yes, it is better for you to have some domestic technological capabilities. It's better for growth, it's better for jobs, it's better because it gives you more leverage around the world as well. Then the question becomes, what can you do about it to change that, right? Some people argue that Europe should do another Airbus in AI, right? And so Airbus was a very successful initiative by most accounts in creating a peer competitor to Boeing. At the same time, there were various national initiatives to see the semiconductor industry which failed dismally. And so what's the difference? I think a key difference is that most technology underpinning modern airplanes were essentially there when Airbus was set up, right? So the jet engine was the first, sort of last major technological invention, and so it was a relatively static technology field, right? It's much harder when you're facing a moving target, which had been semiconductors and AI, and so you throw everything at large language models. Maybe the future of AI is small language models. Maybe it's something else, right? And so that's much harder to do. And so I think we're better off to focus on fundamentals. And I think the most fundamental challenge in Europe is the lack of a homogeneous market for firms to scale into and service.
On that basis, it's perfect. You've questioned out perfectly at the right time. So thank you very much for all of you for sitting patiently and listening. I hope you've taken many things out of it. I think meeting people like Carl puts you on a 30,000 foot level very quickly on global economics. So I very much enjoyed it. Hope you did too. Would you please join me in thanking Carl for coming? Thank you.